Okay, we'll make a start if that's okay. Thanks all for coming. Just so there's no, the fire alarm goes off, it's the real thing, isn't it? And the toilets are just outside there and around these. Right, but welcome everyone. I'm going to hand straight over to my colleague who's going to introduce our speakers and get some stuff.
Great, thank you very much for coming, everybody. As you just heard, my name is Mike Collier. I'm here not because I have any particular expertise on the subject, but because I'm Director of Research and Global Studies, and it's something that, like most of us, I need to know about, so I'm very keen to hear what our speakers have to say. They're going to speak in, if you've seen the programme, left to right in the programme. So on my extreme left, Professor Gail Davey, who's Professor of Global Health and Epidemiology at the medical school here on campus. Second, Vicky Hellon, who's Editorial Community Manager at F1000 Research and works a lot with the Wellcome Trust, so she's going to be speaking about that particular relationship. And finally, James Baker, on my immediate left, who's Lecturer in Digital Humanities, again here at Sussex. Our speakers are all going to speak one after the other, and we should then have a good chunk of time at the end if anybody has any questions or comments. So if you have any points that you want clarified, save them till the end, and we'll have a good, at least half an hour, I think, at the end to discuss things. So to start, okay,
great.
Go ahead.
Great. Well, again, thanks very much for coming. I'm very happy to be here explaining a little bit about the why of open publication, and particularly from my own experiences, which are rooted very much in a low-resource setting. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes giving a little bit of background and then explaining why I'm so strongly in favour of open publication, and then giving just a few author, researcher type insights into the processes that I've faced so far. So some relevant pieces of my research background to this discussion are that I spent my early postdoc years in a low resource setting. So after time at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, I moved out to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, initially for 2 years, but that became 10 years. I was a research, early postdoc research fellow, and then I guess a senior research fellow or equivalent at Addis Ababa University. And I've illustrated the building that I worked in as my main base in Addis. This is Tukurambesa Teaching Hospital, the largest hospital in the country with about 700 beds, and the School of Public Health was on the second floor of this. But I'm in public health, and more specifically in neglected tropical diseases. So as often as not, I was working in much more remote situations. And I suppose this setting on the right, which is in southern Ethiopia, is, one example of one of the places where I was doing field work. And I think from both of these, you can probably guess that I'm leading on to one of the issues about open access. It was very, very difficult to get access to journal articles of quality journals from either setting in Ethiopia. On the right, it's kind of fairly obvious there was no internet, no electricity at times, and so, blocks at those stages. But then even on the left, at the biggest teaching hospital in Ethiopia, it wasn't straightforward to get articles. Yes, again, there were internet and power difficulties, but even when those were overcome for that favourable 10 minutes per day, there were inevitable issues about journal access, despite the efforts of some publishers through Hinari and other routes that are meant to improve access from loads or settings. You were always being asked to put in the password and to contact the librarian, and of course the librarian might well not be there or might have changed over, and often nobody knew the passwords, and so there were just a series of blocks in terms of getting access to the high quality journals. The other point I wanted to illustrate was the focus of my work, which was into an extremely neglected, although very common in Ethiopia, disease. And this is called podoconiosis. I'm not going to go into it in any detail now. It's a leg swelling condition, and you can see by these pictures immediately it's very stigmatizing and highly disabling. And there are over 1.6 million people affected in Ethiopia. But at the time of my work, at the beginning of my work, there was nothing being done for these patients through government services, with 2 small NGOs giving a bit of care, but nothing else at a policy level or within the state system. So I was beginning a research program into this condition, very aware that in fact there was almost nothing happening for patients. So these 2 things and the overall sense of research as a public good, which was just so apparent again in that setting. It's apparent here, but it's even more apparent maybe somewhere like Ethiopia, where every resource has to be thought over and priorities decided. So research is a public good. Any money used for research might mean less money for patient care. So we've got to take responsibility for getting the results out there. And particularly, I felt it was so essential to quickly get research findings into policy, into the hands of people that might actually influence the roadmaps and the policy documents within the Ministry of Health in Ethiopia. And of course to potential implementers, which might be outside the state system. So yeah, there was this kind of compulsion to get the research findings out there and adopted as quickly as possible. And as I've mentioned before, a range of frustrations in accessing articles in those settings. So that sets the scene, and I've put here the sort of 3 options that we've worked through probably in the last 15 years or so. I almost turned to Vicky for that, but the first step, I suppose, was the option for open access publication in the traditional journals, and I'm kind of including under that grouping that they're often, maybe they started off 100 years ago as paper, then they became online and paper. And those sort of journals tend to have an editorial team handling review and typesetting and doing all the copy editing. So that's a sort of whole package that they offer. So that was probably our first option, was to start paying for open access within those journals. I'm sure many, if not all of you, have done that. And then, of course, the purely online journals came up, and one again paid for open access in these, although very often for authors based in low resource settings, the fee would be waived or reduced. And in these journals, again, very crude characterisation, but there's a sort of partly voluntary team handling review, the editorial process. And there's more author responsibility for a range of things. And I put up diagrams and figures because they were always the thing that we struggled with most as a team. We just didn't have the expertise in our team to make the lovely figures and diagrams. And the traditional journals used to really do that for us. And then this new wave, the buck was passed back, and we really weren't very good at it. We struggled a lot with that. And now this moved to open publication, which, and Vicky's going to describe a lot more. So in purely online journals, and as I understand it, with editorial team typesetting and overview of the review process as well. So those are the sort of models that we seem to have worked through with our team. And so now I'm just going to give a little bit of my responses to our engagement with Wellcome Open Research. And, it's a pretty new thing, but, these are our impressions as a team so far. First of all, if you go onto the website, it's quite an eclectic collection. It's anybody who is supported by Wellcome can publish there free, but other people can publish there at a fairly low cost. And it's, there's all sorts of things, really interesting. But if you have, a kind of 10-minute browsing window one day, then, and I usually would jump onto PLOS, neglected tropical diseases, for example, then I might not go there, although of course one can search and filter. So there's a huge range of articles up there. That's great in many ways, but again, you will probably want to employ some search options if you will just go into browse. The other thing that's occurred to us is that there's a less obvious acceptance or publication moment. Citation can precede peer review and final approval. And I think that will be fine, but we've got to get used to that. And so, there's often a moment when you've actually got your acceptance email and you circulate it to the other authors and you go, well done everybody. And that's not quite as clear with this model. And again, I don't think that's a major problem, but it's just something to adjust to. And then the other thing that we've realised is that the reviewers' comments kind of come in rather continuously, rather than being collated and then sent to you in one email. And at times it's been harder to involve the entire team in responses. And so then it's often been the corresponding author has just taken responsibility as each one comes up. Now again, that will depend very much on how your team works and how busy all your team members are preparing other articles and who has got the concentrated time to spend on the reviewers' comments. But again, it's partly that there's less of a moment around which the team can coalesce. Now, I feel these are all pretty minor points compared to the benefits of something like Wellcome Open Research, and I'm going to let Vicky explain those in more detail. So these are kind of rather nitpicking things, and I don't want to go kind of give you an overall negative impression, but I just think those are some of the things that our team will be adjusting to over the next few months and years. And really, I think that's a very good point to hand over to Vicky. Please ask questions towards the end when we're all in the panel together, but I hope that set the scene, and now you'll get the real detail on this particular platform.
Great, so yeah, as Gail said, I'm going to be talking about Wellcome Open Research in a bit more detail. So, as she said, it's a funding, it's a publishing platform for Wellcome funded authors. But what I actually wanted to do was start with F1000 Research. So I technically work for F1000. We've been going as a company since the 90s. We started off with F1000 Prime, which is an article recommendation service. And then in 2013, we decided to set up a publishing branch of the company, which is the original platform, F1000 Research. And it's an open access platform with the scope of life sciences. And the real reasons we decided to set up this publishing platform were to do with the current culture around publishing. So we know that scientific publications are a great way to disseminate research. In an ideal world, they lead to the progress of science through reuse of the work and replication. But we also know that scientific publications have become the currency by researchers evaluated by. In particular, access to funding, recruitment, career progression can often be tied to where certain publications are published rather than the actual merits of the piece of work itself. We know there's kind of delays in terms of the publication process working on a scale of months to years sometimes. And this can lead to, and then there's editorial bias in the system, kind of publication bias. And this can lead to research waste and also what's been deemed the reproducibility crisis. So keeping all of this in mind when we were setting up, we wanted this publishing platform to be a different way of publishing research, hopefully an improved way. I'm going to go through how the publication process works a little bit later, but for now I just wanted to give a brief overview of how we feel we're tackling some of the problems with the traditional system. So the first is speed. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have had the experience of submitting a paper to a journal and then waiting some more and not really being sure what's going on with the paper. So for us, we publish pretty much immediately, but then we do have a formal peer review process, but we do this post-publication. This means the work's out there straight away, it's able to start gaining citations, it's able to start being built on by the community, and we really feel there's kind of no advantages to work being stuck behind editorial closed doors. Feeding into evaluation of researchers, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we know researchers can be evaluated on some quite narrow criteria, particularly impact factor, which we know is very entrenched in the system, but is a flawed metric to be evaluating individual researchers. So for us as a publisher, we wanted to take a stand and say we're not applying for an impact factor, and we hope with the growth of initiatives such as DORA that we really bring back the shift to individual pieces of work, their intrinsic value, rather than the venue of publication. We also want to give control back to the authors and say, you know what's valid to be published, you should be able to get that out there. Journals shouldn't be kind of a barrier to this in that sense. Also, as I mentioned, bias in the system. We know there's been editorial bias against things like negative results for a while, but also we feel if you conduct peer review behind closed doors, this gives an opportunity for bias to arise, hopefully not always, but I think an anonymous process can often lead to referees being overly critical and not really having to stand by their comments. So for us, with this platform, we wanted to counter all of this by being as transparent as possible. This starts with the authors, so when they submit a paper, we also ask them to deposit their source data alongside the article in a suitable repository. So that's out there, it's reproducible alongside the article, and then also open peer review. So we publish all the peer review reports and the reviewers' names as well. Finally, I think overemphasis on traditional research articles is a particular problem. We're not trying to get rid of traditional research articles, they're still the majority of what we publish across the platforms. But for us, we've seen the growth of fields such as bioinformatics, software engineering, and researchers are perhaps producing research outputs that don't necessarily neatly fit into that research article. So for us, we want to be flexible with formatting, but we also want to be flexible with what can be a publication output. So these are all the examples of different article types we publish at the platform. Some of the ones I just wanted to mention were software tool articles. We feel software in its own right should be credited and not kind of a footnote at the bottom of a research article. Data notes, so this is just a data set of interest, not too much analysis, just a way to get data out there quickly and be useful for the community. And also research notes. So this is a small finding with 1 or 2 figures. You're not having to sell the whole big narrative of a research article, but it's still valid data to be out there. Also, something we wanted to kind of push is that, as Gail mentioned, kind of the new online journals, we are online only. And as such, we want to be partnering up with companies that help integrations into the publication process. I think a lot of journals can be guilty of still treating publications as if they're printed in paper format. So these are 2 examples we've employed across the platforms. So the first is Code Ocean. These little widgets can form part of a paper, and it means any code associated with the paper can be run in these widgets by the reader, and any reanalysis and kind of playing around with it that way. So it's helpful for reproducibility. And then also Plotly, who are a data visualization and analytics company, and they allow users to generate interactive figures, and we can now host these as part of an article. So what I wanted to do, if it's not too small, is show you one we've published really quickly. So we've published 7 different articles with interactive figures. It's great to be able to include these. So this one here, if I just go back to the start, you can see you can kind of take out the axes, you can zoom in over the data points, kind of pan around, and also it's got a drop down with multiple graphs on the figure. So the feedback we got from the author was that they were only planning to plot one of the graphs and just stick the rest of the data in the supplementary information, which we know isn't always read. So I think employing things like that are useful, again, in terms of reproducibility, but also having this as part of an article and allowing readers to present their data in a different way. I mean, researchers, and then also readers access it in a clear way. So we're always looking to kind of push the boundaries in terms of that. Great. So F1000 Research has been running for 4 years. We've published around 2,000 articles and we're still going. But we started having interest from funders who really liked the way we were doing publishing a bit differently. And they wanted to set up their own publishing platforms for their grantees to kind of have their name on, encourage this way of publishing and allow their researchers to get their work out there. And Wellcome, when they got involved in 2016, their kind of main objective was to improve the way research is communicated. So yeah, these are the kind of reasons they got involved. So the first was, a service to their researchers. They were looking at giving people quite big grants and seeing 2 or 3 very published research articles at the end of this, which is great. But they also were thinking to themselves, is there work that's kind of stuck in a desk drawer that actually we funded? It'd be great to have it out there. And it would be great to have a publishing platform without any editorial bias so the researchers can just share their work freely. So yeah, a kind of service to the researchers. Also with publishing a wide range of article types, enabling researchers to get credit for different parts of research that they might normally have not been able to get a publication out of. And then also recognising their power as a big funder and if supporting this way of publishing, really supporting that shift in the culture around publishing and again, making that move away from impact factor. Also, as I mentioned, with making sure the data is open alongside the article, hopefully this will help efficiency and reduce any research waste. I am going to spend the rest of the PowerPoint talking about Wellcome Open Research, but I just wanted to briefly mention all of our other platforms as well. So F1000 Research for all the researchers, but after we set up Wellcome in 2016, we also set up a Gates Foundation platform for Gates researchers in November 2016. Last month we launched HRB Open Research, which is a public funder in Ireland, so really great to see a public funder come on board and support this way of publishing. And next month we are launching the African Academy of Sciences platform. So we're really excited about this to be able to showcase the work coming out of there. And yeah, hopefully this won't be the end of it. We do want more funders to come on board and really help that shift in the culture. So how does the publication process work at Wellcome Open Research? As I said, we accept a range of different article types. One of these will be submitted to the platform and then checked over by our editorial team. The difference here is that there's no editor per se checking for the novelty or the significance of the work. We really do want that to be judged by the community afterwards. But the checks we are doing at this stage are that it's readable, methods are adequately described, ethics are there, it's not plagiarised, data has been deposited in a suitable repository so it's open alongside the article, and yeah, just kind of rigorous checks at this point. At this point, the authors are more involved in the process than they perhaps would be used to in terms of we ask them to suggest referees at this point as well. We do check them out for conflict of interest checks, but it is more of an author-driven process as we feel authors are best placed to know who are experts in their field to evaluate their work. If a paper passes all the editorial checks I just went through, then it's typically published on the platform within about a week. So it's a really fast publication process. At this point, it's an open access article, it's citable, but it's clearly labelled that it's awaiting peer review. At this point, we take back control of the process as a publisher. We invite the referees on the author's behalf. The referees hopefully accept, submit their review reports. We give them a quick check over, but we publish them pretty much immediately with the reviewers' names. We then ask the reviewers to choose a status for the paper, which are these symbols on the right here. So a green tick means the paper is technically sound, it's approved, any revisions are minor. A green question mark is approved of reservations, so kind of like a major revision. There's some revisions that need to be carried out to make the work sound. And then a cross is not approved, so there's some fundamental flaws of how the work was carried out. If a paper receives 2 ticks or 2 question marks and a tick, then at this point it's indexed in PubMed and we consider it to have passed our peer review threshold. So these are the minimal requirements for indexing. If it doesn't initially receive these icons, so if it receives just 2 question marks, then the referees can revise the paper, the authors can revise the paper, publish a new version, and then the referees can reassess it accordingly. So what I want to do is take you through a quick life cycle of a couple of the papers on the platform so you can see how the process works a bit more. This is a paper we published last week, so you can see here that it's awaiting peer review, and this is denoted in the brackets of the square brackets behind the title. And if anyone cites the paper at this point, the square brackets always form part of the citation, so it's clear that the work hasn't undergone peer review. This is Gail's paper. I chose it as I thought it's a nice way to showcase how the process works at the platform. So you can see here they published version 1 in September 2017. We asked for a minimum of 2 referees, but we managed to get 4. And you can see here referee 1 gave the paper an approved of reservation status, and all the other referees gave it approved statuses, and you can see their names on there. Also at this point, it's not in this example, but if we have co-reviewers, which is something we always encourage, then there would be multiple names but beneath a number. And we think co-reviewing is a really great way to get early career researchers involved in the process. They can review alongside their PI and kind of get credit for it. And you can see behind the square brackets that the peer review status of the paper is updated as well, so that would form part of the citation at this point. These are the reviewer reports for the paper, so they're published just below the article. You can see the reviewer's name, their status, the actual review report, and then on the right-hand side we also have view counters for each review report, and each report is individually citable. Again, we want to credit reviewers as much as possible. We think researchers sometimes spend hours reviewing papers and minimal credit, so this is more ownership of the review. And you can see both reviewers have also connected the review to their ORCID ID account with that little green symbol. So again, another form of crediting them. In terms of the response to referees process, this all happens out in the open as well. So you can see the authors respond directly to each reviewer. And we really do feel it's more of a dialogue process between authors and reviewers to improve the paper. And also something we found that doing the reviewing process post-publication means there's more of a focus on the technical aspects of the work. There's not questions of should this be published, should this not be published, as it's already taken out of the referee's hands. Also, we ask authors to fill in an amendments box when they make changes and they publish a new version, just to make it clear what's changed from version to version. This is the paper again, but you can see we've published a version 2. When we publish a new version of the paper, we ask referees to reassess it, but particularly if a referee is given it a not approved status or approved of reservation status, we ask them to look to see if they feel the paper's improved. And you can see referee 1 felt it had and updated their status to a tick. The way the versioning process works at the platform is that you can actually access all the previous versions of the article. They're individually citable, and it means you can really see how the peer review shapes the paper. Also, we think having static papers can sometimes be quite limiting, so something we also do is allow authors to publish small updates at any stage. If there's a small amount of data gathered 6 months later, that is not going to constitute a whole new paper by itself, but it's nice, it's relevant to the previous paper, then they can publish an updated version. This example I'm showing you is a method article, so 6 months later the authors felt they'd improved the method. Again, wasn't enough for a whole new publication, but it's nice to keep it cohesive for people who are using this. So, how's it going so far? So we've been publishing just over a year. We've published 200 articles on Wellcome Open Research, and yeah, as we came to the end of that year, we wanted to look at some stats to see how we were doing with this different way of publishing with a funder being involved. So you can see the majority of what we're publishing is still traditional research articles, which is great, but we are infused to see different article types coming through as well, particularly method articles and study protocols. Also, our turnaround times on the top there, so you can see we're really pleased that it takes about 2 weeks to have a first referee report published, and then the median time for a paper being indexed in PubMed is a month. just over. So we're really happy that we've collapsed publication from what can sometimes take months to a year into something that is very speedy. Also as well, with our open data policies, we're really happy that over 150 data sets and kind of having this check pre-publication has led to them being in public and field-specific repositories, and also that we've got some software code out there as well for people to use. The last thing we did as well is we looked at the volume of papers in PubMed and any papers associated with a Wellcome grant. And we're really pleased to see that we're the 5th most popular journal for Wellcome-funded researchers. So I would definitely say it's a success. Hopefully we've exceeded Wellcome's expectations, and we really hope to continue to grow. Lastly, I just wanted to finish on the kind of long-term vision for these platforms. For us, we want to prove that getting work out there quicker can really accelerate the impact of the work when it's kind of up to date. And we think there's benefits, clear benefits of researchers in this, but also broader benefits for society. Also that researchers continue to use these platforms and that we have more funders and institutions come on board. And as I mentioned earlier, really that the publisher role is facilitating researchers' work getting out there, and that researchers really play more of a role rather than journals turning around and saying, deeming work not impactful enough or too specialised. We really think getting it out there and acting as a facilitator makes a lot more sense. Also, by publishing a range of different research outputs and perhaps research that is valid but wouldn't have been published before, means we can look at metrics and hopefully come up with some new ones that avoid impact factor and really focus on the impact of the work itself. Lastly, I just wanted to mention Open Research Central. This is something we launched last year. So as you may, it's sometimes a bit confusing that we have all these different platforms for the different funders, but what we wanted to do is bring them together, and this is what we've done with Open Research Central. I always call it a bit of a PubMed for our papers, so all of the papers across the platforms are included in there, but it will be tagged, this one's published in F1000 Research, this one's published in Wellcome Open Research, and we hope as we continue to grow, this grows, and the long-term goal is to really have the research community play a governing role in this, and yeah, continue with this different way of publishing. Great, thank you.
Okay, so I'm James, I work in the History Department. Back when the Finch report came out in 2012, I was library open access evangelist / coordinator at the University of Kent. It's amazing to see some of the stuff that's happened in the last 6 or so years with sort of the ideas around open publishing and open peer review actually like becoming realities through things like the money that Wellcome's been putting in, so it's great. So I'm going to talk about something completely different that's not sciencey, that's to do with something called the Programming Historian, which I'm involved with. The Programming Historian is a publication which is free and available on open access online, which publishes novice-friendly, peer-reviewed tutorials that, as we say, help humanists learn a wide range of digital tools and techniques. So we're kind of a methods publication that is based online and based on historians more broadly working historical data as in a programming sense. It's been going since about 2008 when a couple of folks in Canada put in a small grant into Niche, which is the one of the Canadian funders. We've got some funding to start off the Programming Historian. And since then it's grown into a large editorial board, which I recently joined about a year or so ago, who not only are a larger group of people than started out with, but are committed to diversity within our editorial portfolio. And we're not funded by anyone, we're entirely volunteer driven, though we would say that we actually work for the publication, I guess in some sense. We're not a legal entity anywhere, no one gives us any money, and everything we do, we are basically a self-publisher in that respect, with little bits of support that have come along the way. So I want to talk about a few things. I want to talk about what we do in terms of open access, open source and open projects, and also open peer review is a big part of this as well, and just go through what we do. So we are Gold Open Access, everything's available CC BY, and all what we do complies with a variety of international open access policies. That means that all our lessons are open access. So if you go to Beatrice Alex's wonderful tutorial on geoparsing English language text with the Edinburgh Geoparser, which will be my example as I go through, at the bottom you'll find that everything is open access. We publish everything and host everything via GitHub. Can I have a few hands if people who know what GitHub is or have used it before, some hands. Good, so I won't baby you too much on that one. But GitHub is, broadly speaking, a code repository that's built up over the years to have a bunch of other functionality, which includes you can stand up websites through GitHub. And we run the whole architecture of our project through GitHub and through GitHub Pages. If you ever want to quickly make a web page, it's probably one of the easiest ways, I think, to make a web page that you can control. There are no charges for what we do, no charges for access to the site, of course, and all the work that we produce is and can be reused. And it is reused quite broadly. So just to show you here, so this is an example of how we kind of host the pages. So this is the Edinburgh GeoParser lesson, and you can see here, although if you don't know the GitHub architecture, this will be a mystery to you, but you can kind of see how the lesson has been tweaked and updated through using the GitHub architecture that enables us to do it. And the same again, that we can do that through the site itself as opposed to just the lesson. So all the site is maintained through GitHub. And we get quite a lot of traffic. Not masses, but we get quite a lot of traffic. So this is what, between 31st January and 1st of March, we get somewhere in the region of about 100,000-ish sessions a month. And one of the interesting parts of what we do, and indeed one of the things that's really justifying why we're open access and our commitment, I think, comes from the cities which we're reaching. We have got a very large community, bizarrely, in places like Bangalore, Chennai and Hyderabad, increasingly coming back to our work, which suggests we are fulfilling some kind of need among low resource sections of people looking to get into programming, for example. That's all Python lessons. Everyone knows what Python is, a programming language. Everyone coming to India, the programming historian is going to Python to try and learn how to use Python. So, peer review. So we just talked about peer review with F1000 and what the Wellcome are doing. So we operate and always have operated with a kind of almost entirely open peer review process, not quite as open as what the Wellcome does. What happens with the programming historian is that we have a kind of remit in terms of which our lesson's supposed to fit. And we ask that people who want to propose a lesson write to us and say, hey, I want to write a lesson on something like this. They're usually then assigned an editor. And once they're assigned an editor, they go off and write the lesson they want to produce. So rather than sort of people come with a fully fleshed thing, they come with an idea to us. And they work with the editor to develop that and to shape that to what our community expects. We then get a few initial reviews from the editor who's actually looking at it. So not the whole editorial team, just that individual editor. Before then, the editor writes a ticket via GitHub issues and posts online that we now have this tutorial that's firstly been proposed, but then secondly is now under review. And at this point, it becomes an entirely open publication process. I should add at this point that we do also have an ombudsman role as part of what we do to ensure that even though we are doing this in public, that people don't feel as though they're going to get subject to harassment. So quite the opposite of the closed peer review creating circumstances in which people do harass people. We know there are many public problems with closed peer review. We're also very keen to ensure that our authors know that they're not going to be subject to kind of public shaming in some way by virtue of the peer review process being public, or indeed the reviewers feeling as though they're getting kind of attacked in some way for what they say. So we have a kind of very strict policy in this because people got worried, I guess, in a way. And so then we get reviews. One of my colleagues, University of Edinburgh, posting a review of this particular essay on the GeoParser. Note that this is in October 2016, and you'll get a sense of the timings that are sometimes involved in this. And then the editors start getting involved. So once the initial reviews have come back, the editors get involved and start working this up towards publication. And for us, this is very much part of a process. So here we have the reviews coming in. We then get the author coming back in September 2017. She had maternity leave, hence the delay in this particular publication. And that kind of conversation keeping going via the GitHub issues page until eventually somewhere at the bottom of that whole ticket, about a year later in this case, we get a publication that is posted. Just like what we talk about with Wellcome Open Research, one of the challenges we have, of course, is that we also want to edit things. Whilst a researcher might want to edit a paper because there's some more data that they've got, we have a fundamental problem that once our lessons are published, they can very, very quickly become unusable because the technologies that underpin them change. And so one of the things we have to deal with is the fact that the nature of our tutorials means that things change and things break, and usually both happen all the time. And this is an example of a very small issue that was going on within a lesson, this particular lesson, where there was a small change being made via a pull request on GitHub in order to make a small change. But more broadly speaking, when you end up going to a lesson page and digging around GitHub, there is a record there of all the things that have happened via the GitHub infrastructure, which is based on open source code or Git, which means that basically there is a full record of everything that's happened, and there's a kind of clear chain of how the lesson got from the original thing that was published to the thing that was published to the thing that's edited due to editorial changes. So you can do tweaks, updating publication dates, and things like that as part of that process. And this happens in public, and when they're not happening directly against the lesson, what's also happening in public is the raising of the issues themselves. So if someone comes across a problem with one of our lessons, and we encourage them directly to post that via the GitHub infrastructure, and they'll say, there's a problem with this lesson, it's not working for some reason, can we do a fix? So all that kind of conversation about a fix is tied in with the chain of custody, in essence, that you get with GitHub architecture, with the edits that are made. So, for example, you end up with something like this, which, to just break it down, in essence shows there's some sort of text that's been changed. In this case, some text that's been added to this particular publication because something needs to be tweaked and changed. And you can see that's part of the open architecture that we have. Unfortunately, sometimes things can't be fixed. We have examples of lessons that are based on software or based on code where, in order to make the lesson work again, would require enormous effort on behalf of the author. The author might not be willing to put that effort in, or simply it won't work. We've currently got a wonderful lesson on using Unity to do virtual reality stuff around historic objects, which is broken because Unity has fundamentally changed how it works. And so that's probably going to go through a process of retirement unless the author can pull together some time to fix that particular lesson. But once again, of course, our retirement happens in public, and we put together very nice things so our authors know that they're not going to get they still keep a publication, I guess, even though the lessons have been retired. And so our lessons end up live and still online, but with this little header that says this lesson has been retired and providing reasons for why it has. Some of the retired lessons are actually still used because people like using old versions of software, but most of them get retired and quietly sit in the background. As you can probably guess from all this, alongside being open peer review, open editorial, we also are entirely an open project. Everything we do as part of the programming story and editorial board happens in public, so not just the comments that are raised by readers saying, hey, this lesson doesn't work, but all our editorial discussions, our editorial meetings happen in public. Our internal discussions, for example, that's something I'll come to, about whether or not we want to have sponsorship of the programming story in the future. We open this out to as part of our public architecture, not because we think people are constantly reading these things and checking up, but it means that if we do want to kind of push that out and ask people, what do you think about sponsorship of programming historian, it's not a separate platform for the rest of those discussions. It's integrated with our existing processes. And so, for example, with the recent discussion on money, we had a bit of an internal discussion, of course, among the editors, and decided a point at which we felt it was okay to move that into a public discussion, and opened a ticket that had some sort of bare bones reasons why we might be doing this, not fully fleshed out. We had many other ideas of what we could do, just to get some responses from the community of readers. We pushed that out via our usual social media things. We've got lots of comments in the community about how we might go about being an organisation that accepted small amounts or large amounts of sponsorship of some of our activities and some of the pitfalls that might come with that. As I said before, even our editorial agendas are in public, and you can see some of those on there. Alongside this, we also maintain that it's important that the project itself is citable as an example of this kind of work happening. And so we dump everything once a year onto Zenodo, which is a big sort of open repository that's run by CERN. So we're pretty happy it will survive. And what gets dumped on there is a deposit not just of the lessons, but the whole project. So the lessons, the issues, the changes, all the work that has gone into the project gets dumped every year onto Zenodo, so the project is citable, and people, if they want to, can see a kind of instantiated moment in time version of all the things that we've been doing as part of the programming story. We also have a commitment to open source and open source values. All contributed lessons make source of open source program language and software wherever possible. And that's really important to us, going back to the point about stuff breaking. We don't just believe in open source because we get to use free software, neither do we believe in open source for some kind of spiritual reasons. It's also really important to us because it means that when we have lessons, they're more likely to survive, more likely to be sustainable. It means that our readers are more likely to learn things that they can reapply somewhere else, as opposed to just learning this discrete way in which Tableau works, for example, which means they can't do anything with that anywhere else. So we encourage our authors to write sustainably. Part of our authorial guidelines include tools and tips for how to write sustainably as an author on the web, which is not just about open source, about the web more broadly. Our peer review guidelines stress to peer reviews that it's important to think about sustainability. Are all software versions and dependencies listed in the submission? What are the sources of data for the submission, to ensure that it's not just reducing the work as editorial team further down the line, it's also ensuring these lessons have a genuine longevity and people can rely upon them. And this really helps us build our user base and communities around open source tools and data and give us confidence of our readers that they can use our lessons and be able to use them again in the future. And it also helps us to tap into existing open source things that are going on. Some of you who know anything about programming languages and things will know that Python a couple of years ago moved from Python 2 to Python 3. It's fundamentally different programming architecture, and it caused us a massive headache because we were trying to think of whether to migrate all our lessons across from Python 2 to Python 3. However, it, by virtue of being part of that open source community, enabled us to at least draw upon what other people were doing and to see other people's examples and how they were dealing with this process, and then to be open ourselves about how we were trying to deal with it. So hoping people can learn from how we struggled to deal with moving from Python 2 to Python 3. We are also open to translation, and this is something that's been happening with the programming story increasingly over the last couple of years. Because interestingly, what we found is that open source does not always mean our lessons are open to translation. So the example of our Edinburgh GeoParser lesson really brought this to light for us, because it doesn't work in Spanish. You can't translate this lesson to Spanish and make it work. So the GeoParser doesn't work with non-English language. And the context for this is that 5 of our editorial team are Spanish. Since 2016, but really in earnest since 2017, we've been having a massive Spanish translation initiative as part of the programming historian's work. And this requires us not only to translate the lessons, but also everything. The front page, the stuff I showed about diversity, the stuff I showed about peer review, everything has to be translated and kept up to date, which has taught us a huge amount about the relationship between openness in terms of open access and stuff, and actually openness in terms of linguistic diversity. For example, you can't keep tweaking your documentation if it has a knock-on effect on translation work. In the time since they've been working on this, they've translated an amazing 29 lessons of the programming historian. This is one of our editorial pages. Antonia does a huge amount of work for the programming historian, translating stuff. We translated 29 lessons into Spanish, and at the Digital Humanities Awards this year, we won one of their category awards for that work. And we are starting to get a growth of traffic, particularly from South America. You might have noticed Bogota was one of our cities that's growing in terms of our user base, particularly from South American users who are coming to us for the kind of things we can offer. As I said, this particular lesson wouldn't translate. And it's illuminating, as I said, because of the ways in which it got us thinking about not tweaking our editorial materials too much. But it really got us thinking about what is open. It made us kind of pull together a greater consideration of language interoperability into our author and review guidelines, which we're currently implementing. We wouldn't reject a lesson on this, but we're asking reviewers to think carefully about whether they think something could be translatable. We're just about to issue a call for a lesson that comes to us in Spanish rather than coming to us in English, because we think it's important in terms of our open architecture and open thinking that we translate something from Spanish to English, to figure out how difficult that is to do sometimes, rather than the other way. And in our desire to support more language and more communities through open access, we've set up an architecture by which a group of people from another language community could come to us and say, we want to set up a language initiative as well, and we want to kind of start translating your materials to fit another community which may be from a low resource background. And we've currently got bubbling some people thinking of doing this in French, which we're hoping can target some areas of Central and Western Africa, which we think there are need and sort of desire to take on, to use some of the editorial, well, use some of the lessons that we have available. So the programme historian has taken a long journey to this point over the last 10 years or so. I've only really been a part of it the last year, as I said, but I've written and reviewed for the publication for years, and it's really been amazing to watch the growth of this publication from a kind of small niche effort just focused on Python to something that has a wide range of tutorials aimed at historians and humanists who are interested in getting into some kind of computational analysis of data. It's also been really interesting to see how the stuff around the lessons has grown and expanded, and much of our work these days is not just kind of on the open access side, it's really on the open project side and trying to be open as an endeavour as opposed to just being open in terms of something that's making available lessons that people can use. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think it's fascinating.